Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchuk, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchuk Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. All right, so before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to invite you to check out a few great free resources that I created just for runners. To get them, all you have to do is click on the link in the show notes or visit www.stephanienatchuk.com. If you visit my website, there's a little pop-up box that comes up and it'll prompt you to enter your email address, and these guides will be sent right to your inbox. The first guide is my fueling guide for runners. So, in this resource, you'll find my top fueling tips for runners, as well as some specific meal ideas for both your pre and post run fuel. If you've been struggling to understand what to eat when to support your running and just figuring out what those meal ideas, what those meals look like, what kind of foods you should be including before versus after you run, what the difference is between pre and post run fueling, then this guide is exactly what you need to get you started on the right path. The other guide that I created is my strength training guide for runners. So this guide includes both a PDF resource, has some tips, guidelines, and links to my YouTube series where I actually walk you through all of the exercises in the program. This is a great beginner strength training guide for runners who want an effective but efficient full body workout that helps support the key muscles and movements you need to run stronger and injury-free. So once again, both of these guides are available together. I have them put together as a little bundle for you. You can just click on the link in the show notes or go over to www.stephanienatchuk.com. Enter your email address just the one time, and both of these free guides will get sent to your inbox right away. I hope you enjoy these resources and find them helpful in supporting you and your running. And now let's get into today's episode. Aspartame, one of the most common, most predominant artificial sweeteners, has been making some headlines again recently. And we've been hearing a lot about it. It's kind of re-sparked the conversation and the debate around artificial sweetener use. So I just want to do a little kind of brief summary of what's been happening with the headlines that you probably have seen, explain that a little bit, and then we're going to talk about artificial sweeteners as a whole for runners, talking about the safety, the applicability, when and where you might see or use or want to use artificial sweeteners, and then really talk about some of the pros and cons, whether or not it's a good idea and something that you might want to incorporate into your nutrition plan. So, of course, by now you've probably seen some of the recent headlines that have been circulating these past few weeks, warning consumers once again about aspartame. So, aspartame is a common artificial sweetener. It is actually a protein, which a lot of people don't know, and it is made up of two different amino acids. So, it is made up of one amino acid that is called aspartic acid, and the other amino acid that we find in aspartame is phenylalanine. And so, this common artificial sweetener aspartame is going to be or potentially going to be added to the International Agency for Cancer Research, the IARC's list as a possible carcinogen. So this, of course, has, set off a lot of revisiting of conversations and discussions and opinions around the safety versus the benefits of artificial sweeteners, and got a lot of people either talking about what that really means, what does possible carcinogen mean in the grand scheme of the environment that we live in, and all of the other things that we know can be cancer causing. I guess it's also helpful to point out that the term carcinogen is something that is potentially cancer causing. So we have different rankings that we can see. So for example, a known carcinogen is something that we know causes cancer. Something that would fall under the IARC's possible carcinogen means that there is limited evidence that this causes cancer. So that's an important kind of point to make, and we'll revisit that closer to the end of the episode. But When we're looking at artificial sweeteners, this is something that we've seen a lot of conversation around for literally decades. I remember being a kid and there being talk about the dangers and the harms of artificial sweeteners. And as time has gone on, we've really come full circle to be talking about, their properties and their potential to cause things like cancer, their potential to either decrease and help with weight loss or maybe cause people to gain weight. You probably have heard that one before. We've heard that artificial sweeteners contribute to higher appetites or blood sugar issues. One of the ones that's come up even more recently is the impact of artificial sweeteners on things like our gut microbiome. So there's a lot of different that there's been, potential for artificial sweeteners to maybe cause health concerns and health issues. And so I think that it leaves a lot of people very confused. It leaves a lot of people feeling unsure, feeling like they don't have an option, between artificially sweetened beverages, for example, or things that have sugar. Well, we hear all the time how we shouldn't be having too much sugar and how potentially harmful or bad sugar can be. And so it's like, well, am I just stuck drinking water? Is that my only option going forward? Is that I can only have water and nothing else? Because if sugar is bad and artificial sweeteners are bad, like how do I manage this? What do I do here? And so, runners who are looking to minimize their sugar intake might find themselves more inclined to sip on diet soda, or maybe you've been choosing electrolyte replacement products for your workouts that don't contain any added sugars. But the thing is, if it doesn't contain added sugars, it's probably going to have some artificial sweeteners in it. Now, of course, there's not just aspartame that falls under the umbrella of artificial sweeteners. There are actually a number of different artificial sweeteners available on the market that are approved for use in Canada. An artificial sweetener is a sugar substitute, or what we sometimes will call a non-nutritive sweetener, that's a food additive that provides the sweetness of sugar. It can either be as sweet or sometimes it's even more sweet than sugar, meaning that you need less of it to get the same sweetness factor that sugar would provide, with significantly less calories than a sugar-based sweetener. And so this would make it what we call a non-nutritive sweetener, meaning it has no nutritional value. It's a low calorie or 0 calorie sweetener. So in the context of aspartame is a protein, as I mentioned before. It's made up of 2 amino acids. So if you were to consume large quantities of aspartame, you would actually be getting protein from aspartame. You'd be getting calories from aspartame. But it is so much sweeter than sugar. It is hundreds of times sweeter than sugar. And so that means that we only have to use a teeny tiny quantity of it, like milligrams of it, to get the same sweetness. So it has calories, but we're using such a minuscule, teeny tiny little bit of it that that doesn't actually contribute anything to our day. So some of the artificial sweeteners that you'll find as a whole include acesulfame potassium, aspartame, polydextrose, saccharin, stevia, sucralose, and sugar alcohols. Now, stevia is one that's really interesting because it, of course, does come from a plant extract. And so while it does fall into the category of a non-nutritive sweetener because it doesn't have calories, like we don't get calories from stevia, it does sort of fall somewhere in between what we would consider to be like an artificial sweetener and a natural sweetener, because it does come from a plant source, but of course it still is a food additive and of course is no calories. This would be kind of, in contrast to natural sweeteners that would be, white sugar, brown sugar, honey, corn syrup, maple syrup, agave nectar, things like that that are giving us sweetness, but also a significant amount of calories. We find the natural sweeteners, both, of course, naturally in many different foods, and then also as an additive. So as a runner, you're going to find artificial sweeteners in a number of different products that you come into contact with, we'll say, in your daily life, and also when it comes to fuels and things like that that you choose for running. So artificial sweeteners are often found in sports drinks or electrolyte replacement products. So chances are if something tastes sweet, but it doesn't have any sugar in it, doesn't have any calories in it, then it's going to be artificially sweetened. Sugar-free beverages, of course, right? That's going to be like your diet soda, even things like low-calorie juices, stuff like that. Those are going to have artificial sweeteners in them generally. And then, some candy and desserts are also going to use artificial sweeteners. Protein products, so whether that's like protein bars, protein cookies, other like high protein sort of, I'll say, replacement foods, whether that's like keto versions of things and stuff like that. A lot of those are also going to use some artificial sweeteners in them to keep the carb content low. What a lot of those products are going to use, you'll find a variety, but what's very popular in those types of products are going to be your sugar alcohols. And so that's going to be like xylitol, maltitol, anything that ends in OL, that all sound, that's going to be your category of sugar alcohols. And those are a little bit different and kind of an interesting sweetener because they actually have a similar sweetness to sugar. They're not super sweet compared to sugar. So you're going to find larger quantities of them in these food products. Rather than finding, milligrams of something like aspartame in a product, you're going to actually find grams in a product. Now, this, of course, is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, except that for some people who are sensitive, we can get some GI issues, some gastrointestinal upset from consuming these larger quantities of sugar alcohols. So that is something to keep in mind. If you've been buying maybe the low sugar ice creams or other desserts, if you've been doing a lot of protein bars, a lot of like low carb kind of snacks and stuff like that, you may find that you're consuming a pretty good quantity of sugar alcohols, and you may find that you don't feel great. You get maybe some tummy trouble after you consume those foods. So, of course, we can find artificial sweeteners in a lot of different places in our diet and, have been for many, many years now. But the big question that people keep coming back to is, are they safe, right? Are they safe to use? So, all of the artificial sweeteners that have been approved as food additives in Canada are considered safe as long as we stay within the recommended daily limits. So, there are upper limits for safety that we don't recommend people consume more than that per day. And as long as you're within those upper limits, you're good to go. And so, for aspartame, this limit is set at 50 milligrams per kilogram of your body weight per day. And so an average can of Diet Pop is going to contain about 200 milligrams per day of aspartame. So that means if you want to do some quick math with me, that means that a 70 kilogram person could consume 17 and a half cans of Diet Pop per day before they would hit their personal upper limit for aspartame. So is it possible, right? Is it possible for someone to consume enough artificial sweeteners in a day? That's whether that's aspartame or otherwise. The other artificial sweeteners have their own upper limits, but I'll just give you aspartame as an example just because it's so top of mind. And I think aspartame too is probably the most highly debated artificial sweetener. That's the one that people are most familiar with and most familiar with the controversy around. So in theory, could someone consume 17 and a half cans of Diet Pop per day? I'm sure someone out there is. Maybe someone who's listening to this podcast episode, maybe someone that you know, maybe you could send them this episode and say, hey, listen, maybe you should cut back a little bit. In theory, yes, it is possible that a person could be consuming that amount of Diet Pop on a daily basis. Do most people consume that much artificial sweetener or that much aspartame on a daily basis? No, they do not. I mean, most people that I talk to, at the high end, I would say most of my clients, it would be a can a day. Like I think for the most part, the people that I talk to, it would be like a can a day. Some people, it can be quite a bit more than that, but definitely nowhere near 17 and a half cans a day. I mean, that's well over 3 liters. It's a lot, right? It's a lot of fluid, first of all, and it's also a lot of diet soda. So, kind of coming back to the question around the safety of these artificial sweeteners, when we look at the information from the International Agency on Research on Cancer, the IARC, they have different categories for substances that give us kind of a ranking of where they fall for how how much evidence or how much support there is for something being listed as a carcinogen, or how strong of an impact that's going to have. So aspartame, what's coming down the pipe for aspartame is that it may be listed as a possible carcinogen. And while that sounds very scary, and at first it kind of sounds very like, oh, we should really be careful and, maybe cut back and be mindful. What this actually means is that there is limited evidence that a substance causes cancer. And so that doesn't mean that it is a known carcinogen. So this is in contrast to things on that list from the IARC that are known carcinogens, something like asbestos. This is something that is a possible carcinogen, meaning there is limited evidence, as opposed to things that aren't on the list at all. There's really no evidence for, period. So I think with all food additives and with all of these things that we come in contact with potentially throughout our day, I think it's worthwhile to have research on this stuff, right? We want research to be done. We want people to be looking at these things. We want people to not be ignoring substances. And of course, we want tons of research to be done on things that are going into our food supply and things that we're going to be ingesting on a regular basis. But we also have to look one step further and understand that the dose is always an important part of this conversation, and rarely is something either good or bad. There's going to be a spectrum of where, someone is safe consuming maybe the odd can of diet pop, or enjoying that as an alternative to sugar sweetened beverages, and where maybe we're going to get into trouble, say if someone is consuming vast quantities of these products. So for us as runners, choosing to sip on a diet drink sometimes, or sometimes choosing a sugar-free electrolyte replacement powder or beverage, doesn't look like it's going to cause any long-term harm. What it really comes down to is personal preference and understanding your unique nutrition goals and needs. And what I mean by that is, how does it feel for you to use sugar sweetened products versus artificially sweetened products? Things that maybe have like white sugar in them versus things that are sweetened with other, maybe we can call them like more natural sweeteners. Again, sugar is sugar, and carbs are carbs for the most part. So whether you choose white sugar or maple syrup or honey or anything like that is really going to come down to personal preference and taste, and how things sit in your gut. How do you tolerate things when you're running? Because you can find evidence and opinions and stuff like that, basically for and against pretty much everything you put into your body. We want to really be thinking about what makes sense for me, what works for me, what do I like, what works well with my training. And, also we have to look at the convenience and the affordability of the different products that we're choosing. So purchasing something that is all natural, made with maybe natural ingredients or whatever, but you're paying a premium for it, might not always be necessary if we can get the same effect by, choosing something that's a little bit more cost effective, especially if we're doing a lot of racing and a lot of high volume training, where we do need electrolyte replacement products and carbohydrate replacement products regularly. It can start to add up. I like to talk a lot about how running is not always the cheap sport that it's sort of marketed as sometimes. And it's amazing when we start to look at the investment that we make in our running, how much it can really add up to. So on the topic of personal preference, something else that's really fascinating about artificial sweeteners is taste. And, you may be one of these people, or you've probably met or talked to people who will tell you they just can't stand the taste of anything that's artificially sweetened. It's like, oh, aspartame, I just can't stand it. They just notice right away if something has artificial sweeteners in it. And this is not just an excuse to not have to drink diet pop and to just stick with regular drinks. It actually can really be a difference in how people perceive and how people, get that taste perception from different types of sweeteners. Some people do notice this really strong bitterness that comes out in some of these artificial sweeteners. One of the big ones is stevia, where some people really notice this like noticeable, very prominent bitter flavor when they use something like stevia or stevia sweetened products. And so, if you're finding that you're taking something, using a product, taking something, and it just doesn't taste right, you don't like it, it doesn't taste sweet, it tastes kind of bitter and weird, that's fine. Try something else. That everyone's got a little bit of a different taste perception when it comes to these things. I also already mentioned, some of the concerns and challenges we can see with gastrointestinal upset, issues with, cramps, bloating, gas, diarrhea from excessive use of sugar alcohols, which is one type of artificial sweetener that we see. And so, having some of these sport or these low carb kind of products, especially before a run, may not sit that well, maybe something that you need to be mindful of. And then, of course, we see a change in taste perception when we run. This is really, really interesting. It's a really fascinating part of, how our brain and our gut and our body and just our perception of the world around us changes when we're exercising, is that things that taste one way before exercise, when we're at rest, we have a change in taste perception when we're exercising. So the part of our brain that perceives the flavor of foods and beverages and things is different when we're running. And so that's a really, really important factor to take into account when we're finding the products, the electrolyte products or the chews and gels and all that kind of stuff that we might want to use, is we have to practice these things in the context of our running. We have to practice these things while we're training, use them during our long runs, practice using a lot of them, because taste fatigue is also a real thing where we get really tired of the same flavor over and over and over again. We need to change it up. And so this is where, artificial sweeteners can be helpful or maybe sometimes be a hindrance. Maybe we want a little bit of variety with our choices. And so having some, kind of carbohydrate containing fuel, having some artificially sweetened fuel, that's going to give us a little bit of variety. Or sometimes, though, those artificial sweeteners just don't make sense because they're taking up space that we actually should be putting towards real fuel and real carbohydrates. And I'll give an example. I was talking to a client today, actually, the day that I'm recording this podcast, and we were talking about her marathon nutrition plan. So she had done a long run over the weekend. And, we kind of looked at what she drank and ate and everything she consumed during that long run, added it all up. And she was just below 30 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So she was just kind of touching that minimum requirement for grams of carbs per hour. And, her race is still a few months away. So she got lots of time to still practice and kind of increase things. But, I said, for your electrolyte replacement product, what are you using? And sure enough, she is using a sugar-free and artificially sweetened electrolyte replacement drink. And so my recommendation was to try something that actually did have some carbs in it, because otherwise we're going to have to double the number of gels and chews that you're taking on that long run. Instead, if you drank 2 liters of an electrolyte replacement beverage that had some carbs in it, instead of the artificially sweetened electrolyte replacement drink, that probably is going to contribute a much more significant amount to get us up to that 60 grams of carbs per hour that we're aiming for. So, it's not that the artificial sweeteners are bad or doing any harm or are excessive by any means. It really just, in that context, it didn't make a ton of sense to be using an artificial sweetened product versus one that had regular sugar in it. So, when and where it makes sense to use artificially sweetened products really comes down to your goals, your training volume, and what else you might be eating or drinking during that run. Of course, we can talk about preferences for flavors and cost and lots of other things too. But we also want to just look at the logistics of it and see what makes sense in the context of your training plan. So, for example, the example I just gave of my marathon client is one kind of way of looking at it. But on the flip side of that, when you're in your off season or in a lower volume base building phase, you may want to choose more sugar-free beverage options throughout the day because your body needs less carbohydrate calories during those phases of your training. So you may be focusing on getting more carbohydrate calories from whole food sources, right? Because they'll keep you full, they're going to give you more fiber and nutrients. And it may make more sense to sip on a sugar-free beverage throughout the day for enjoyment and just for variety's sake. Because, plain water is great. And you'll never hear me say a bad thing about drinking plain water. But sometimes it doesn't always hit the spot the way that something else does. And so that's a place where we don't want to be getting a ton of calories from sugar sweetened beverages because that's going to take away from our ability to get enough fuel and fiber and nutrients from the whole foods that we want to be filling up on during those lower volume training phases. But when we need energy to pump out a 20-mile long run or, maintain a really challenging tempo pace, the truth is artificial sweeteners just don't have the calories or the energy that we really need in our muscles and in our bodies. So in those contexts, choosing a sugar-free product for electrolyte replacement or energy isn't going to make sense and just isn't going to cut it. So it's not out of the question, but you can really streamline your whole nutrition plan by skipping the sweeteners sometimes and maybe including them at other times. So at the end of the day, we know that artificial sweeteners in reasonable quantities, and what I mean by that is less than 50 milligrams per kilogram per day of aspartame. And of course, the upper limits for all of the other artificial sweeteners that are approved for use in Canada, these numbers can easily be found online. So reasonable consumption of artificial sweeteners is considered safe. But given the time and the place and your volume of training, they may not be the best choice for runners all the time. The same way we periodize our training, we want to periodize our nutrition. So, really looking at what are your fueling needs for the different phases that you go through throughout the year are going to help you to look at your nutrition requirements, make sure that you're meeting your fueling goals so that you can really perform your best and get rid of, the risk of any negative side effects from some of the sweeteners that just may not agree with us before a run, like those sugar alcohols that I mentioned. So, at the end of the day, just like most things in nutrition, the right answer is somewhere in the middle. Artificial sweeteners are not the be-all end-all replacement for sugar. We should not forego all sugar sources and only rely on artificial sweeteners. At the same time, there is an upper limit for safety, which I know most of you are going to be nowhere near hitting, but there's sort of a time and a place for both. So I hope that you found today's episode helpful to give you a little bit more information and context around, the real story behind artificial sweeteners, what the sort of scary headlines that you've seen coming up from the media really mean, and how that can apply to the choices that you're making in regard to your day-to-day fueling choices, your day-to-day beverage choices, and of course, what you're taking along with you during your long runs and on your races. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today to check out today's episode. It means so much to me that you have, decided to hang out with me for a few minutes and learn a little bit about nutrition, training, recovery for runners. And I can't wait to share more with you in next week's episode. Once again, if you are looking for help with your nutrition plan, or your running training program, I am really excited to currently be accepting clients to start working with me one-on-one or in my online group program. So you can learn more about how we can work together on your unique personalized nutrition and training strategy by visiting www.stephanienatchuk.com or, of course, checking out the links that you'll find in the show notes. Thanks again for listening today, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.